Excellent. Very good. This was good. You did well.
All right. Yeah. All right, and just to say again, if you are here for this talk, please be sitting next to each other. We need one big audience, so if you're in the outskirts there in the wings, please come up and sit next to each other. We are all friends, we're all family here. Good, great, excellent, I love it. All right, and we'll cut the ambience. Oh, now it's serious. Thank you for coming to my talk. This is Learning and Motivation, Designing the On-Ramp of Your Game. This is Sunday at 5 o'clock. I know it's the time that you love to be learning about things. You're really motivated on a Sunday afternoon, which is of course not true. So if I can teach you anything at Sunday at 5 o'clock using what I'm about to show you, hopefully you can take this information away and teach others with these theories. Also, I don't know what you know and what you don't know, so to alleviate that, I have made this entire presentation interactive. This way, you can tell me what you'd like to learn. So let's go ahead and get started. Oh, and one more thing, I am very nervous right now. So if I forget to breathe, but please remind me, thank you.
Breathe now. Breathe.
The community here has been very supportive all weekend, so I feel like I'm in good company. All right, so who am I? My name is Josh. I am a PhD student at Northeastern. Broadly, I study game user interaction, how players interface with the technology of their game. I study games with a purpose, and we may or may not get into today what those are. I study learnability, how games teach you how to play them. And playability, what makes a game engaging, what makes it usable, what makes it learnable. So what is this presentation? How does it work? This is a Twine game. This entire thing was made with Twine. So since it's interactive, I want to know a little bit about you. Who here is a student, by show of hands? Okay, so we have a few students. Who here is an educator? A couple educators, yeah? Who here makes games? A few game makers, all right. Who here has heard of cognitive load theory? Most of you? Good, all right. Who's heard of self-determination theory? Most of you, okay. And who knows who James Paul G is? Couple, okay, great. So hopefully if you know some of this stuff, I can put it in new perspective. If you don't know it, great. We'll just go through and see where this takes you. I have right here the pink orb of agency, and I'll toss that over to you if I can. Oh, great. So when you have the controller, when you have the pink orb of agency, and we come to a selection of blue links, you may also see some yellow links, we'll get into that. Just go ahead and call out where you'd like us to go, and we will go explore there. And then when you have made your choice and you feel satisfied that you made a meaningful choice, please hand off the orb to the person next to you so that they can take a turn as well. So our progress today, as we go through this game, will unlock a deeper understanding of why some tutorials suck, and how to teach your players anything that you want, how to engage and motivate your players, and the theories behind all of this. We may also get to why serious games and transformational games are difficult games to make. This presentation covers a lot of what I've seen today at other talks. If you've been to the design talks, the educational game talks, you'll hear a lot of the repeated themes that have been going around today. And hopefully I will cover some of the academic why behind the advice that you've been hearing all day. So, let us first check the map, as you do. This game has 5 major worlds: engagement, cognitive load theory, self-determination theory, G's principles of good learning, and serious games, with a few bonus stages, tutorial tips, playability heuristics, and of course, tutorial island. But I will leave it up to you, he with the pink orb of agency, to choose where to go.
I'll choose G, number 4, because he's my hero.
All right. So James Paul G wrote a decent amount about how good games use principles that reflect a lot of what good learning looks like. And broadly, what he talks about is described into 3 pillars: empowered learners, problem solving, and understanding. Where would we go now?
Let's learn about problem solving.
Problem solving. Problem solving is kind of what you think it is, organized into 7 principles of well-ordered problems. The problems should be pleasantly frustrating. There are cycles of expertise. You provide information on demand and just in time. You can all read this. I'm not going to read it for you. Where should we go?
Let's go to the pleasantly frustrating.
Pleasantly frustrating. So, who's seen a graph like this of the zone of proximal? Okay, a couple people. Basically, the idea here is there is a comfort zone that you have. And at the edge of that comfort zone is where the learning happens. That's where things feel fun. They feel pleasantly frustrating. And outside of that is where things feel impossible. They feel overwhelmingly challenging. So this is this middle ground here, right at the edge of your comfort zone. But within your comfort zone, we call that the zone of proximal development, or the edge of the regime of competence. Things feel challenging but doable, and even when you fail, you can see if you're making progress, how you're making progress, and that failure is informative. We get the player in this zone through dynamic difficulty, through well-ordered problems, good feedback, good pacing, and eventually the player will figure out where their comfort zone is and how it's changing as they go through the game. A good game doesn't judge the player for whether they finish, how they progress. It encourages them to keep trying through failure. Or as G says, the final boss is willing to wait until I am good enough to beat him. And so we could go back to a few things, or check out any of these links. Where should we go?
Can you scroll down?
Of course.
In the list. Yeah, can you go to information on demand and list of time?
Yes. So, I remember back when I was a kid, getting a game, being super excited, that I take it home in the car ride and I read through the entire manual, and then I'd get home and try to play it, and I have no idea how to play. Even though I read all of that information, it was all in the textbook right there. I didn't know what was going on because that information wasn't relevant to me yet. It wasn't when I needed it. It wasn't something I was referencing. I was just getting this whole text dump all at once. This image right here is from the tutorial of Dark Souls. It's telling you, I don't know if you can see it, it's kind of small. It's giving you the control instructions for how to parry and riposte. Right as you come up to an enemy that you can do exactly that on, and you can try it out. This is the idea of information on demand, information just in time, context sensitivity, also called situated meanings. Humans are really bad at just getting an information dump all at once. So information is best when you feel like you can use it right then and there, or you can go reference it when you need to.
Let's talk about skills and strategies.
Skills and strategies. Your skills that you learn as you play a game, as you go through a class, these are tools. And a hammer is nothing without a nail. A tool is nothing without a purpose. If you want to teach a skill, you should first be introducing a goal, a reason to progress, a reason to use that skill. And then the skills become the player's strategy to accomplish those goals. In Overwatch, there's an idea of animation canceling, of your reloading, and then halfway through reloading, you can do like a melee attack. And what this does is it saves you time because you don't have to wait through the whole animation. And you can get some extra damage in this attack. And players practice this over and over again. It's a difficult skill to master. But the reason that they go through all that repetition is because they know they're using it as part of a strategy, as part of an overall goal that they have in the game. when you're in high school and reading Shakespeare, do you know what goal you're trying to reach? Do you know what discrete skills you're trying to build up to form as a strategy? In games, players see skills first and foremost as a strategy for accomplishing a goal, only secondarily as a set of discrete skills.
Cycles of expertise.
Generally, a cycle of expertise is discovering a problem, realizing that there's a skill that solves this problem, learning the skill, practicing it, making that skill automatic, challenging your understanding of the skill, and repeating this process of challenging your understanding of the skill and practicing it and learning it better until it becomes really automatic and you consolidate it, you chunk it as a skill that you understand automatically, and then you discover that this skill is not enough, and you discover a new problem, and then you start all over and learn a new skill. This cycle alternates between fruitful practice and getting new challenges. When done right, it creates this feeling of progression and accumulation and building up your expertise. When done wrong, it creates a stagnant or grindy kind of experience. And so all good games, all good learning should introduce this idea of a cycle of expertise, that you're always building up some expertise with something. If you didn't see before, yellow links, you may pick them. They take you to a totally new topic.
Fish tanks?
Fish tanks. A fish tank is a small, simplified ecosystem. And games are really good at using fish tanks. There was a talk earlier on having just a few key concepts, a few key interactions, and using the games to show the dynamics of the system, to show just how these pieces interact with each other. Whereas normally, in the real ecosystem, these ideas would get muddied down. In a fish tank, you can clearly see, well, there's a fish, there's some rocks, there's some plants, and not much else. And I can clearly look at how these things interact without considering all the different kinds of fish, all the different kinds of plants, and anything else that might be going on in there. When you use fish tanks, you help the learners to begin to know what to pay attention to. They avoid the garden paths, where they're sort of forming a mental model and going down one way, forming hypotheses about how the system works, and then they realize they're wrong, and they have to turn around and go all the way back and try something else. This limits the complexity that they're dealing with so that they can focus on just learning these interactions before moving on.
Sandboxes, please.
Sandboxes. Sandboxes are another great tool to put in your tutorials. A sandbox is a safe haven, something that looks and feels real, both lowered consequences of failure. In this example of a Mario level, the players ask to jump over this gap. And it's okay if they fail, because there's solid ground underneath. They can try it a couple times until they get the hang of it. And then they're introduced to basically the same challenge, but now with the safety net removed. This first challenge here is a sandbox, because they can play around with it, and it feels like a real challenge. They're being asked to do something authentic, but there's a safety net. There's lowered consequences for failure. This encourages risk-taking and exploration. You want your on-ramp not to punish them early, and not to punish them for the same mistakes repeatedly. So by mimicking the real expectations, but lowering the consequences for failure, you create this experience that still feels authentic. It feels like an accomplishment to complete, and it lets them perform before they are competent. This is a really important idea, that if the player can try things out before they have this sense of mastery, they will learn by doing. When the player is learning, failure is informative and not a final judgment.
I have to finish the list of all our problems.
All right.
Yeah.
So when you design a game, when you design any kind of learning experience, you want to be designing the problem space so that the player, as they progress, they form good mental models, good hypotheses of how the systems work. Again, avoiding those garden paths. A bad problem space could be too freeform or too complex. So you want to be using those fish tanks so that there's reduced complexity, and you want to navigate the player toward understanding problems one step at a time. so that they come up with solutions that generalize. They come up with solutions that are what you want them to expect. And as we know from a lot of research in cognitive science, the order of how you present problems in your problem space is really critical to how they first start forming these mental models. That doesn't necessarily mean that the problem space has to be linear, but it is a designed experience. You're designing the choices that they're going to make, the problems that they might encounter, so that they understand the small problems and the larger ones and so on. If you've played any Mario game, Nintendo does a wonderful job of giving you a well-ordered problem space.
Yeah, let's talk about Mario.
Okay. So I'm going to try not to butcher this word. Kishu Tenketsu, I believe is how it's pronounced. This is a 4-act, 4-beat narrative form that's often used in Chinese poetry and Japanese comics, and Nintendo uses it very often to teach you a new skill in Mario and some of their other games. So the first stage of this approach is an introduction, a safety net, a sandbox, a safe first encounter, and it only introduces one interaction, one mechanic, one idea. And then it develops that idea, takes away the safety net, and gives you increasingly harder challenges on just that one mechanic, still in isolation, still in a fish tank. And then it twists it. It introduces other challenges, gives you new perspectives on this mechanic. It might bring back old skills that you've mastered and ask you to combine these two skills. Or try something, make you understand this challenge in a whole new perspective. And then finally, there's a conclusion, a final test of mastery where you can demonstrate that, yes, you've figured out this skill, and it closes out the narrative structure. So this right here would be an example of an introduction. The coins in the level design show you that you can jump from wall to wall, and it's up to you to figure out how. And they provide a safety net that until you show that you can do this skill once, you don't get to proceed. And so this is a sandbox, a fish tank, and an introduction all at once. We see this 4-step progressive structure not only in Mario levels, but it's been argued that in strategy games, the 4X games, you first explore as an introduction, then you expand and develop into the land, you exploit it with a twist, and you conclude. MMO quest structures often take you into an area, let you discover the area, explore all around it, understand it, and then have some final progression. You could argue that this goes into music with attack, decay, sustain, and release, or some other stuff, but at that point I'm stretching the metaphor. Why don't we go back to the map and check something else out?
Alright, may I take cognitive load theory for a second?
Of course. So according to cognitive load theory, which is a prominent way of explaining how learning happens, it's a 3-step process. First, the learner needs to consider multiple interacting elements and then form these elements into a cognitive schema and chunk this scheme into a single atomic unit. During this process, the learner feels some amount of cognitive load, which is broken down into 3 elements of cognitive load: intrinsic, extraneous, and germane. And an ideal learning situation happens when the learner isn't overloaded with this amount of cognitive load. Would you like to see an example of chunking in action? Okay. Memorize this pattern. You can see it? You have 5 seconds? All right. Do you have it memorized? All right, we'll change our associative representation. This is the same pattern, but move the numbers kind of closer or further apart. Do you still have it memorized now? All right, we're going to change the symbolic representation now. The same pattern. You have it memorized now? Okay. For those of you that did get it, why was this second pattern easier? It was easier because you have chunked the Konami code, this cheat code very much used in Konami games. You have chunked that as a single unit. You have memorized the sequence. The sequence and its units were meaningful to you. You've practiced it, you've rehearsed it when you tried to input the code over and over to get 30 more lives. You've chunked the Konami code as a single unit. You've formed it into a cognitive schema. And the benefits of a cognitive schema are faster retrieval speeds. You can pick it out of your brain quicker. It requires fewer cues to try to retrieve that memory from your brain. You process this automatically. You don't think of it as a sequence, but as a single unit. And this comes at no extra cost of resources or cognitive load. And so that's the value of chunking things into cognitive schemata. Where to now?
Playability heuristics.
Playability heuristics. So elsewhere in this game, I provide some tips for how to make a good tutorial. This is basically the academic version of that. Many researchers, including Korhonen, Koivisto, Weiberg, lots of people have taken a lot of time to figure out what makes games enjoyable, what makes them usable. And so these are things like, does the player experience flow? Is there proper challenge? Are there clear goals or player-created goals? Is there a balance of challenge and strategy and pace? Does the player feel in control? In terms of usability, are you providing audio and visual feedback? Are you providing good indicators? Your user interface is simple and pleasing. Your controls are standard and consistent and flexible. The user can customize these controls. You provide help on demand and just in time, like we talked about. You minimize cognitive load. There are many more here. And if you would like the full list, like 14 pages of it, send me an email. I'll have my contact information up at the end. So this is just a taste of the very large world of playability heuristics. And given that, where would we like to go now? In control, yes. So this is another one of James Paul G's principles of good learning, of empowering the learner. And one way that you can empower the learner is by letting them be a co-designer, letting them actually produce content and actively be part of the decision-making process in what they get to learn. This idea of agentic play, of letting them own what they're choosing to learn, letting them buy into the experience, having engaged participation, all of the things that you guys are now doing, wonderful. In RuneScape, if you know the MMO, Jagex actually lets the players design the game. They put up polls and surveys of what would you like us to make next for your experience, and the players get to vote on what they would like the developers to work on. So in designing a game, in designing a learning experience, ask yourself, what gives my players the feeling of being in control of their own learning experience? How can they customize their experience to suit their needs, to form their own identity and personal narrative? And with that, where do we go now?
Distributed knowledge?
Distributed knowledge. I love Shane Koizan. He's a wonderful poet. And learning is very difficult and is made easier when you don't have to learn everything by yourself. You can distribute the responsibility of learning something across players, across time, or even let the game handle some of the learning for them. Letting the players share experiences with each other so they don't all have to make the same mistakes themselves, and they can share, here, I made a mistake, let me tell you about it so you don't do the same thing. Distributed knowledge comes in two forms, primarily, smart tools and cross-functional teams. And these two ways of distributing the knowledge really help reduce the burden on the learner or the player to figure out everything on their own.
You gotta let the game handle some of it.
So this gets to the idea of smart tools. You don't need to understand transistors to use a computer. You don't need to know how a gun works in order to reload. The character handles that for you. The character handles all of the minutiae, so you can focus on the high-level strategies that are actually valuable to you. They're actually important to the game. Reloading in a first-person shooter is a smart tool. When Lara Croft climbs a mountain, that's a smart tool because you don't need to know where she's grabbing. You just need to be able to tell her, climb this thing, and she'll do it. In real-time strategy games, you don't need to tell every single unit where to move. You can say, all of you get to this spot. They'll figure it out. Most of your household appliances, washing machines, stereos, I'm sure you can think of many others, these are smart tools. You don't need to know the minutiae of what they're doing. You push the button of the thing that you want to happen and it'll take care of it. When you're developing a game, your physics engine is a smart tool. It takes care of a lot of the calculations, so you don't have to program them yourself. I would challenge you to think of what smart tools are being used in your classrooms, in your educational games. How are you using smart tools to reduce the burden on your learners?
Is it competence? Am I saying?
Competence. So competence, or mastery as it's called, is one of the 3 components of self-determination theory, which is a theory of how players are motivated, how people are motivated. And we already saw how in Mario, Nintendo uses competence, teaches you competence through scaffolding to make you feel the sense of mastery. Dan Cook wrote an excellent article on Gama Sutra about understanding in your game what are the atomic skills. If you can break down the mechanics into a single core piece, and then draw out how these skills build together to form a tree of dependencies of this skill that the player needs is dependent on this one, and that will lead to this skill and this skill. If you can draw out those atomic skills and build up a skill tree, you will be able to understand your game better and how you're giving your players competence and mastery. We've already kind of covered that you want to create a pleasantly frustrating experience by being at the edge of the player's comfort zone, and this is all going back to building that competence, building up what your player considers as their skill set. And now I believe it's about 5:30 already, so unfortunately we're going to have to wrap it up. Learning and motivation in games is guided by some known theories of psychology, cognitive load theory, self-determination theory, flow, and the good learning principles of James Paul G. We can combine these theories with the industry knowledge from experts like Zello, who we did not get to in this talk, to give us a greater understanding of how theory and practice fit together. I have in here a list of tutorial tips and a bunch of other things. This game's source code is available at this link. You can download it and play it yourself if you'd like to experience more. We visited 22 pages today, but there are 90 in total. So please, there's way more to learn. If you were interested, explore this. I've been Josh. Thank you. I know it's 5:30, but there's nothing else, so we might have time for questions. Yeah.
Obviously, 99% of the stuff educators must not know, because it never makes its way to courses, so that's one thing, okay? I mean, it's like dark ages. And second, so I want to get your comments on that, maybe, you know, where this great stuff from game stuff, it's like we gave the world AI and then the digital chips, you know, the high-speed chips that they do with. Likewise, this is another thing that comes out of gaming. The second one I want to ask is, do you know anybody who's applied this stuff to teaching software, like JavaScript, Python, stuff like that? Because, again, they're absolutely in horrible shape. And I was just wondering if you knew any games or game-like approaches used generally in teaching and specifically in learning software.
So to answer your first question, James Paul G actually writes about this as he describes his principles of why they're not being used in schools now. And that's because it would be really difficult to change the entire system. Not only does it cost financial resources, but these are fundamentally different ways of approaching education. And to move an entire community of educators and administration involves changing a lot of minds and hearts and completely reworking the entire system, which is a slow process and takes a lot of resources. And I encourage you to look up the books that James Paul G has written because he goes into more detail there. As to your second question of teaching software, there are many games that teach programming now, if that's what you were asking about. And so there are many gameful approaches to learning how to write programming. I don't know any about learning how to design software because design is a more creative approach. But definitely there are games being made to teach things using these principles. Thank you. Any other questions?